Developmental Language Disorder for Speech-Language Pathologists. Thank you for your interest in learning more about DLD. My name is Liza Finestack, and I am an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm also an ambassador for the US's Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorder, or the RADLD team. The US RADLD team includes parents of children with DLD, clinicians, as well as researchers. We have been working together to provide information and materials, not only for you as an SLP, but also for students, parents, teachers, administrators, and other providers. As a speech-language pathologist myself, I want to assure you that you have been doing great work supporting individuals with DLD. I realize that the term DLD might be somewhat new to some of you, while on the other hand, some of you are well-versed in the term and nuances of DLD. Regardless of where you are coming from, as we learn more about DLD, the US RADLD team wants to provide you with additional information and resources to further support you and to empower you to help educate others, such as administrators, educators, policymakers, and families. We are excited to work together to better serve individuals with DLD. To get us started, we have created the short presentation with 3 modules. I will begin by providing an overview of what DLD is. Then, another ambassador will provide information regarding ways we can use the term DLD. In the last module, an ambassador will talk about why using the term DLD is important to further advocate for individuals with DLD. What is DLD? Let's look at these facts. There are at least 2 children in each classroom that are 12 times more likely than their peers to have difficulties with reading, spelling, and math. By adulthood, are 3 times more likely than their peers to experience clinical depression due to language difficulties, and are 6 times more likely than their peers to experience clinical levels of anxiety due to language difficulties. Now, what if I told you that there is an internationally accepted term that we can use to describe these students, and that term is Developmental Language Disorder, or DLD. Many children with DLD are likely already on your caseload and receiving appropriate services, but many probably are yet to be identified. You are likely the only one that really knows this. We want to give you information not only for you to better understand DLD, but so that you can feel empowered to advocate for individuals with DLD by sharing information and resources with families, teachers, and administrators who are most likely unaware that DLD exists. So let's dig in. What is DLD? D, developmental, meaning that it is not acquired. While the direct cause is still uncertain, there are strong genetic links that impact language development beginning at birth. Specific language weaknesses associated with DLD change with development, but DLD persists with development. L, language. It is characterized by weaknesses in expressive and/or receptive language. It is not merely a speech disorder, although many children may also have speech impairment. And D is for disorder, not delay. It is a lifelong condition that children do not grow out of. Language is being processed in a different way in the individual's brain. It impacts each individual's languages. Learning more than one language does not cause DLD. Putting all of this together, we can see that DLD is a neurodevelopmental condition that emerges in early childhood and frequently persists into adulthood. People with DLD have significant difficulty learning, understanding, and using spoken language. There are many other terms that we use for DLD. These terms vary based on setting and administration needs. Here are some of the terms that have been used in the past or are currently being used to describe individuals with DLD. Professions, industries, and even states vary in the terminology that they use. For example, a clinical psychologist may diagnose a child with DLD with language disorder. An insurance company might identify individuals with DLD as having expressive language disorder or expressive and receptive language disorder, while an educational team may use the term speech or language impairment. Additionally, researchers have identified children with DLD using a wide variety of terms, including specific language impairment and primary language impairment. There are likely to be some nuanced characteristics that differentiate these terms. However, DLD encompasses children who have been identified by any of these terms. We are not suggesting that we need to replace all of these terms with DLD, but we are recommending that as professionals, speech-language pathologists use the term DLD when talking to parents, teachers, administrators, among others. As you will see in our modules, this will allow us to better serve individuals with DLD and their families. It is important that we have a unified term. Look at this quote from a mother of a child identified as having speech and cognitive difficulties. So basically, I want to say that with our first IEP meeting, I specifically asked, I'm like, is she autistic? Like, what exactly does she have? I wasn't given anything else, so I didn't know. So does she have a learning disability? To this day, I am probably still very confused on what exactly she was labeled with. A history of disagreements and differing opinions regarding the criteria and terminology used to discuss and diagnose children's language difficulties have created barriers to preventing and intervening on language and learning disorders. Over the past decade, various stakeholders have come together to identify a term that can be used regardless of setting, as well as internationally. A major advantage of using the accepted term of DLD is that it allows families to find resources and supports more easily, and it connects families and individuals together. Here you can see a simple breakdown of how DLD has a profile that is unique. In contrast to individuals with diagnoses whose profiles include weaknesses in language development and are associated with other conditions such as Down syndrome, traumatic brain injury, stroke, hearing loss, autism spectrum disorder, individuals with DLD experience language weaknesses not associated with a known biomedical condition. That being said, it's important to note that individuals with DLD may have co-occurring conditions such as attention deficit disorder or emotional behavioral disorder. It is common for individuals with DLD to also experience weaknesses in attention, executive functioning, speech development, and reading development. Individuals with DLD may also have cognitive skills, including nonverbal cognitive abilities that are below average, but not considered an intellectual disability. There does not have to be a discrepancy between a child's nonverbal IQ and language performance for a child to have DLD. Oftentimes, though, DLD is a hidden disability. Many children may not be identified as having DLD because their language weaknesses are not seen or not disruptive enough. But in truth, individuals with DLD are struggling with daily communication, reading, and writing demands. DLD impacts their friendships, mental health, as well as academic and professional success. Let's look at how DLD fits into the bigger picture. In this figure, we have included terms associated with speech or language impairment that are noted in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for IDEA. Under IDEA, a speech or language impairment is defined as a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects a student's educational performance. You can see that language disorder fits in the broad dark purple circle that includes conditions associated with speech or language impairment. The yellow language disorder circle inside the dark purple circle includes DLD as well as language disorder that is associated with another condition. The yellow ring shows that individuals with language disorder may also have a speech sound disorder. For both individuals with DLD and individuals with language disorder associated with another condition, language weaknesses may cross any and all domains of language. There may be weaknesses in phonology, syntax, morphology, semantics, word finding, pragmatics, discourse, verbal memory, among other areas. This wildflower garden doesn't look the same all the time. Flowers will die off, new ones will sprout, some flowers will blossom in the spring, others not until late summer. As the seasons change, so does the garden. We can think of DLD in the same way. For individuals with DLD, their language areas of strength and weakness will change not only over time with development, but also based on specific contexts, similar to a garden. You can imagine a child who doesn't talk at age 2. Having the child use words with different sounds is likely the main concern. But then, once the child begins using words, the concern is that the rate of growth is too slow, or that the child only uses non-specific terms. So the quality of the child's vocabulary becomes the focus. But then later on, the child may drop grammatical endings past when it's developmentally appropriate, or have difficulty with formulating questions in complex sentences. This could impact their writing and reading comprehension. You see, the flowers in the garden keep changing. Let's take a quick quiz to summarize some of the things you know about DLD. True or false? DLD is associated with a biomedical condition. That is false. Children will grow out of DLD. That is also false. DLD can co-occur with other neurodevelopmental disorders, such as ADHD. That is true. To be diagnosed with DLD, there must be a mismatch between verbal and nonverbal intelligence. That is false. And finally, if a child has DLD, growing up learning more than one language will make the condition worse. That is false. Here are the references associated with Module 1. In the next module, you will learn how you can use the term DLD in your clinical work.
Moving on to Module 2, let's discuss more about how you can identify DLD and how a DLD label works within the school and private practice systems. My name is Alyson Abel, and I am an associate professor in the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at San Diego State University. Now that you know how DLD is defined, what do you do with that information when you're practicing? Qualifying a child for services under IDEA and diagnosing a child with DLD can co-occur. To qualify for services, the child has to meet state district criteria, which are out of your hands, and show a need for services as a result of the disability. Similarly, outside of the school setting, there are criteria that have to be met when working with insurance companies, so the speech and language services can be provided. So, to a certain extent, eligibility is a set process. But, as we all know, eligibility is also dynamic. Early on, speech or language impairment is a common eligibility criterion. In fact, recent data for children ages 3 to 5 years old show that 38% of children receiving services through IDEA were eligible under speech or language impairment. As children get older and the nature of their disability, as well as the demands of schools change, we see a shift where eligibility may fall under specific learning disability, or SLD, more than speech or language impairment. The percentage of children qualifying for services under speech or language impairment drops to 16%, and SLD constitutes 36%. The drop in percentage of children receiving services through speech or language impairment as their primary disability category may be due to children testing out and no longer meeting one or both of the criteria to receive services through IDEA. Importantly, just because a child loses their eligibility under speech or language impairment or tests out completely doesn't mean they don't have a disorder. Just like how not every child who has ADHD qualifies under a 504 accommodation plan, and not every child with autism qualifies for special education services, not every child with DLD qualifies for services either. But you know this. You are the eligibility experts and the experts on what really goes down at your state, district, and school level. We're just asking that you do what you're already doing with eligibility and say DLD when it fits. This allows you to follow your local rules and share useful information with related professionals and families. There are benefits to providing a DLD diagnosis in addition to or in spite of eligibility. Using DLD as a diagnosis provides tools to help the garden grow. These tools may be useful for other educational professionals, families, and the child themselves, points that we will discuss later in Module 3. Diagnosis is determined by evidence-based practice using cutoff scores and professional judgment controlled by you, unlike eligibility, which is often highly constrained. So while you may not have control over whether a child is eligible for services and what their eligibility criteria is, you do have control over your diagnosis. Differential diagnosis guides treatment. Your treatment and the resources that you provide to families, other professionals, etc., can be better guided by the DLD diagnosis than by the more broad eligibility criteria of speech or language impairment, SLD, mixed expressive receptive language disorder, etc. Other diagnoses may be present, but the DLD diagnosis will remain. Children may have multiple diagnoses, but DLD will guide families through the language part of their children's needs. The DLD diagnosis remains even without eligibility. Giving the child and family the diagnosis of DLD arms them with information they can use to help get their child the support they need in and outside of the schools. An important point to remember, however, is that if you suspect that a child's DLD symptoms might be associated with an undiagnosed biomedical condition, a referral to a relevant medical or clinical professional is, of course, warranted. This referral step does not prevent you from supporting the child with the language challenges they face in the meantime. So you may be thinking, I already have to determine eligibility. Adding a diagnosis seems more work. In fact, I would argue that you're already doing heavy lifting. For eligibility purposes, you have to establish a language deficit, so you're already assessing the child's language strengths and weaknesses. You can use much of that assessment to help guide a DLD diagnosis. To assist, there are screeners, which we'll provide links to, and telltale linguistic signs that you can use to identify DLD. The assessment and in-depth look at the child's language skills, in addition to classroom observations, anecdotal evidence from the student, classroom, and parents, will do double duty, also guiding your intervention to support the evolving strengths and needs of the student. Returning to our garden, what might we see in each of these areas of language at different points in time that would help point you to a DLD diagnosis? As I go through these, please keep in mind that there's a lot of variability in DLD. Not all children will show all these symptoms, and some language patterns may still be used just more slowly, less often, or less accurately than peers with typical language development. Also, and this is critical, these are only symptoms of DLD when they are not dialect appropriate. Like all other areas of language, children with DLD may or may not show deficits in phonology. When they do, the profile may look like speech sound disorder or phonological disorder, and indeed, DLD and SSD phonological disorder do often co-occur. Some of the difficulties we see are in acquiring and using sounds, And when children enter the school years, we may see difficulty relating sounds to letters. A commonly shown clinical marker of DLD is deficits in phonological working memory, which can be easily assessed using a number repetition task. The vocabulary deficits in DLD change throughout the lifespan. Early on, we see a late onset of first words and limited use of vocabulary, such as the overuse of words like this, that, these, and verbs like want, go, get, do, put in spoken language. This limited vocabulary will occur in spoken and written language. Vocabulary deficits also appear in using words with multiple meanings and extend to word learning, such that children with DLD take 3 to 5 times more exposures to new words to learn it, even when the word is explicitly taught. Grammar is one of the most commonly affected areas of language in DLD. Early in development, we find that children with DLD are delayed, and when they start combining words, the earliest type of syntax. We also see missing or incorrect words, so you may hear utterances like Josh come over and play, where they like to eat, I went to practice so I was done with homework. Children with DLD have limited productivity of early grammatical markings, meaning that they may rely heavily on words like is, but not use or limitedly use other markings like are, were, am. Children with DLD leave off word endings that are critical for grammar, so they use sentences such as, yesterday I walked to school, the dog is walk. Where do he go? Importantly, children with typical language also go through a phase where they leave off these endings, but children with DLD are in a prolonged period where they leave them off. Critically, this is only a symptom of DLD when this pattern is not dialect appropriate. As children move to using more complex sentences and questions, these constructions may be awkward sounding, such as, where did they do like to eat? Before I go to school. A good number of studies show that children may produce sentences that are complex, but not comprehend them. All the grammar deficits I mentioned will appear throughout childhood in both written and spoken language. For children with DLD, we find deficits spanning spoken discourse and comprehension of discourse. Children with DLD may have trouble understanding discourse, particularly when they are required to make inferences or understand abstract or figurative language. Spoken discourse will likely be hard to follow, which could be due to the discourse being out of order or missing elements, or because difficulties with grammar affect the discourse. For instance, children with DLD may have difficulties using pronouns that result in an overuse or underuse of pronouns, which make comprehension of the discourse difficult. Reading deficits often parallel language comprehension deficits. For instance, if a child cannot understand a complex sentence when it's spoken to them, they won't be able to understand it when they read it either. Children's reading comprehension deficits will show up as difficulty answering questions about the text, even when it's read to them. They may show particular difficulty making inferences and understanding figurative or abstract language. Some of these challenges may not appear until later in the school years when reading demands increase. We may see co-occurring DLD and dyslexia, so don't rule out DLD just because a child has a dyslexia diagnosis. Like reading, writing also often parallels spoken language deficits. Particularly, we see immature syntax and vocabulary in written language in older children. We may also see difficulty with spelling. At the level of a narrative, we also see difficulty organizing paragraphs, both within paragraphs and between paragraphs for longer writing samples. This may parallel spoken discourse. In particular, we may see a lack of language being used to create cohesion in the sample, such as before, after, if, then. Like reading, these deficits won't appear until later in the school years. So as you embark on this journey of dealing with both eligibility and diagnosis and all it entails, We wanted to provide you with some example wording for providing a diagnosis with or without eligibility. The first example on the light purple bubble on the left is broad and can be used regardless of where you are working. Suggesting that individuals can learn a lot of great information about DLD online will always be a great suggestion. In the bubble on the right, the child may be meeting eligibility for services under the speech or language impairment category, but also may be eligibility for special education services under the specific learning disability category, in which case the child may not be receiving direct SLP services at that moment in time, although they still may receive monitoring or consultative services from an SLP. The final example in the bubble on the bottom includes the ICD-10 code for mixed expressive receptive language disorder instead of eligibility for those working outside of the school IDEA system. This example is for a more challenging situation where you're trying to explain a diagnosis that doesn't meet eligibility. Here it's important to explain A, what DLD is, B, why DLD doesn't equate to eligibility for services in the schools, and also C, why not receiving services does not mean the child does not have a language deficit. This should be followed up with resources and information about DLD for parents. We'll provide you with links to specific websites that will benefit families at the end of this presentation. You may also find that your colleagues use a variety of terms to label language learning problems. As we'll discuss more in Module 3, there are great benefits to all members of the child's care team using the same terminology. Here we have provided you with possible wording to introduce DLD to your colleagues. The same websites that we'll provide you with at the end of this presentation can also be shared with your colleagues. Let's take a quick quiz to summarize some ways you can use the term DLD. The first statement, clinicians have control over children's diagnosis, is true. For diagnosis you do, but for eligibility there are constraints. The second statement, if a child is eligible for services, they may also be diagnosed with DLD. Also true. Eligibility does not exclude diagnosis and vice versa. The third statement, in addition to a typical evaluation, I need to gather much more information in order to identify the symptoms of DLD. This one is false. You already collect so much information for eligibility purposes that you already have a lot of what you need available to you. Looking more in depth at the data that you have and adding a few pieces of data will help you move toward identifying DLD. And the last statement, as children age, DLD will look the same. Also false. As children grow and their language use and the language demands change, their linguistic strengths and weaknesses will also change. In the next module, you will learn how you can use the term DLD to advocate for individuals with DLD. And here are some resources from this module.
We've arrived at Module 3. So far in this talk, we have covered the foundations of the term DLD, how it is identified, and how it interacts with systems for determining eligibility for services. In this final section, we'll shift our focus from the construction and mechanics of the diagnosis to its value. We all know that childhood language impairments have gone by many names. You may be thinking that another term doesn't change much about our practice or our services. In Module 3, we hope to show that shifting our use of terminology can have a real impact on our practice, our clients, and our field. Hi, I'm Jean Tighe. I'm a clinical speech and language pathologist, a board-certified specialist in child language, and a doctoral student at Kean University. So you may be thinking at this point in the presentation, if I'm already identifying language needs and qualifying the child for services, why does it matter if I use the term DLD? As we'll discuss through this final module, terminology really does make a difference. Diagnosing DLD and using the term DLD in your clinical work and communications with your clients and colleagues has potential benefits to you, to the family of your student or client, and to the child or teen themselves. Let's look at these more closely. The first potential beneficiary of using the term DLD is you, the speech and language pathologist. Diagnosing DLD and using that term with your students or clients and their families can improve your work life. We all need to work with parents or caregivers of the children who are our students or clients, and we want those relationships to be trusting and positive. Parents look for a diagnosis that they can understand to explain the challenges that they see in their child's daily life. When we don't provide a diagnosis, we're leaving this desire unmet. Studies of the experiences of parents of children with language disorders show that they often don't understand their child's language problem, and they can feel stress, anxiety, and frustration as a result. Some parents also report lower levels of trust in professionals who do not provide a diagnosis. So when you're the practitioner who does provide a clear diagnostic term and demystifies the language problems, you're laying the groundwork for a positive working relationship with the family of your client. Traditionally, many parents of children with DLD have been told that their child's language skills are delayed or below average, or simply that their child qualifies for speech and language therapy. These messages about the child's presentation do not convey a cohesive understanding of their profile or the long-term view of their situation. Diagnosing DLD, or using that term, includes acknowledgement that the child is likely to experience evolving changes with language over the course of their lifespan. When the parents are educated about the nature of DLD, they have the opportunity to set realistic expectations for their child. They can move on from always waiting for their child to catch up. Your work with informed parents can then become focused on achieving functional goals rather than trying to meet unrealistic hopes for fixing all the problems. Our garden analogy is useful here. When parents understand that their child's language problems will present differently at different times, we can work together with them to focus on watering and fertilizing useful skills rather than always trying to fill in holes. Parents and caregivers who understand DLD make productive partners for us. So we've spoken quite a bit about parents and caregivers already, although so far we've focused on shifting their perspective in order to create more positive working relationships between the families and us, the SLPs. But beyond that dynamic, families of children with DLD have a lot to gain in their daily lives by understanding their child's diagnosis. So let's take a look. Having the DLD diagnosis helps parents know what to expect in the future. By understanding DLD as a profile, rather than just acknowledging that there are some language deficits, the parent can contextualize and make sense of the difficulties that they observe in their child. When they learn about DLD, many parents can finally understand why their child seemed to struggle in so many different activities and settings. Some children with DLD are labeled as having a learning disability at school, but learning disability doesn't fully capture why other parts of the experience of growing up with DLD are challenging, such as why the child isn't interested in watching movies like their siblings, or why they don't keep up in group social conversations. Learning disability doesn't explain those experiences, but DLD does. Many parents have questions about their child, like, is he just tuning me out? Or why doesn't she play what the other kids are playing? Or are they just stubborn? Learning about DLD can help parents connect the dots. Forming an understanding of a child's difficulties helps parents shift from a deficit model of thinking to a neurodiversity model. Autism and dyslexia are great examples of situations in which a neurodevelopmental disability has been embraced as a part of who people are. Individuals come to see the condition as a part of themselves, a way of being, and learn to work with it rather than trying to fix it. We want children with DLD and their families to have the opportunity to do this. Embracing DLD as one part of who the child is can ease family stressors. This opportunity doesn't begin until they have a clear term to name the child's experience. The term DLD also becomes a tool for the parents or caregivers to use in talking to their child about their own experiences related to their language difficulties. Studies of children with other neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and ADHD show that many parents feel that it's important to tell the child their diagnosis because the diagnosis, as some parents have said in the literature, belongs to the child, not the parents or professionals. Sharing the term with the child is a form of service to help the child develop a positive self-concept, something we'll be talking more about shortly. Parents and caregivers of children with DLD also need to talk with other adults in the child's life about their DLD. Children with DLD experience problems with communication in all environments, not just school. So the eligibility terms that provide a child with access to services at school, like specific learning disability, for example, serve a purpose in that environment, but they don't serve to facilitate conversations outside school about the child's challenges. When parents have a clear term for their child's difficulties, they can use that term to launch important conversations with the other people in their child's life. Explaining DLD to the after-school program director, for example, could make the difference between that child's inclusion or exclusion in groups or activities. A clear label and some associated information about that profile is a critical jumping off point for advocacy for that child in their community. When parents and caregivers have a clear label for their child's difficulties, that label serves as a point of connection with others who share the same profile. A shared term helps families start to find one another by saying, oh, I also have a child with DLD. And that connection gives them the opportunity to peek into someone else's garden, to return to our garden analogy. They're able to talk to each other and have conversations like, what's working in your garden? What's making your flowers grow? Maybe I should try that as well. Through sharing information with each other, families then have the opportunity to support each other and begin to form communities. As we discussed in Module 2, not all children with DLD will qualify for special education or for speech and language services through their school. When a parent or caregiver understands the diagnosis, they can seek out service options even if the diagnosis hasn't resulted in an IEP. They may be able to obtain speech and language therapy outside school, for example, or they may be able to get accommodations for their child through a 504 plan using the diagnosis. These opportunities may also be important for students who have been served at school for a few years and then test out of special education, despite the ongoing challenges posed by DLD. We've discussed that using the term DLD helps you, the SLP. It helps the parents or caregivers and the family system. And all of these benefits funnel down to the individual, the child or adolescent with DLD. Your students with DLD have much to gain when you use the term DLD with them. It's really hard to be a kid or a teen with a disability. There can be so many struggles, and children notice when they're not succeeding like their peers. Many children who experience academic or social challenges internalize the problem. A child who doesn't have any other explanation will often default to thinking they're simply stupid or bad or weird. When we diagnose a particular disability, we create the opportunity for the child to learn about it. They can begin to view their experiences as having a cause rather than defaulting to negative self-judgments. We've created these opportunities for children with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and other disabilities by making those terms household words and commonly using them with our children. Children, teens, and adults with DLD deserve the same opportunity to develop self-understanding and a positive self-concept. Educators are always emphasizing the importance of student self-advocacy. It's very difficult to advocate for yourself when you can't explain your situation. Providing the term DLD and a kid-friendly explanation of what it means is a critical form of clinical service to the child. By teaching the child about their DLD, we are giving them the tools they need to self-advocate by explaining their DLD to others. This often begins with a self-disclosure statement. We want our students and clients to be empowered to make clear statements like, I have DLD, so this might be hard for me. Or, I have DLD, so it would be helpful if you would. Studies of children with communication disabilities have suggested that children who self-disclose their communication disability are perceived more positively by others than if that disclosure was made by a teacher or parent. In fact, others perceive the child most negatively when the parent discloses the disability. We can infer then that when a child is able to say, I have DLD, so, and make a self-advocacy statement, they're opening the door for others to see them as capable, independent, and approachable, and to get their needs met. We've talked about how diagnosing DLD helps SLPs, families, and individuals with DLD themselves. We also want to offer you the idea that widespread diagnosis of DLD helps the big picture in terms of advocacy and research. First, we need public awareness to fuel advocacy efforts. The dyslexia advocacy movement is a great illustration of this concept. The movement started with parents coming together, forming grassroots groups, and advocating to schools, communities, and their states to gain recognition of dyslexia as a disability and for provision of services and accommodations that people with dyslexia need. All that effort has led to incredible advancement in policies and supports for people with dyslexia. It has also made dyslexia a household word, which enables more people to recognize the condition and thus grow the community of people who associate with it. None of that would be possible without a shared term. The shared term brings people together. If families of individuals with DLD can find each other, they can form groups with the power to influence advances in policies and practices. Another big picture issue that relates to our use of the term is research. DLD receives less research attention than other less prevalent neurodevelopmental disorders. The more research we have about DLD, the more we can help the population. But research is restricted if people don't identify with the profile. Parents can't respond to calls for participants for a study about DLD if they don't identify with the diagnosis. Also, research funding is hard to come by for conditions that are not widely known as being prevalent, which DLD is. By using the diagnosis and spreading use of the term DLD, we're helping researchers do the work that moves our services forward. Now that we've taken a detailed look at the many benefits of diagnosing DLD and sharing the term with our students, clients, families, let's review some of the main ideas with one last quiz. First, diagnosing DLD benefits you, the SLP. This is true. Caregivers often report feeling confident in talking about their child's language difficulties. This is false. The available research we have says that this is commonly a problem. Sharing the term DLD can connect children and families with a community of people with shared identities. True. And finally, talking to children about neurodevelopmental differences reduces a child's negative feelings towards themselves. This is true. That concludes Module 3, but before we leave you, we'd like to summarize the presentation with a few key takeaways. DLD is a lifelong condition that impacts the individual in varying ways throughout their lives, much like a garden in which different plants bloom in different seasons. The term DLD does not replace eligibility terms. It adds opportunities for understanding the child's needs. You already have the tools you need to diagnose DLD while following your school's eligibility process or your clinic's billing procedures. And finally, diagnosing DLD benefits you, the family, the team, and most of all, the child. So we here at the United States Rattled branch encourage you to think language, think DLD. You can find additional information and many valuable resources here at this link tree. Thank you for your time and attention. Remember, think language, think DLD.
Think language, think DLD.